Madhavji, thank you very much. I think under the rubric of BIPA, bold, innovative, proactive, and ambitious, and the 5S of Panchamrit, you've comprehensively summed up the changes and the developments in foreign policy over the past nearly 4 years now. And there's very little left to add to all that you have said. Let me just say a few things. First of all, I think to a lot of observers in India and abroad, it came as a bit of a surprise that Prime Minister took such a strong interest in foreign policy. But right from the beginning, he said two very important things. One, that we can't, of course, India's future and destiny is intrinsically linked to the changing world that we are, and he recognized that the world is in a state of flux and a change that is perhaps rare in history, both technologically, geopolitically, economically. Everything around us is changing very rapidly. And he felt that India cannot be a price taker in this environment, but had to be a price setter, to borrow a phrase from economics, because we were too large and strategically located, too old a civilization to be simply passive observers. The second, that the kind of future he envisaged for India in terms of its economic development and prosperity, he recognized could only be possible if India was deeply engaged with the rest of the world. And here again, I think people forget that as Chief Minister, he had been to 45 countries and had actually, in some sense, transformed Gujarat partly through his external engagement, and he wanted to carry the same thing to the national level. Now, as some of the aspects, what I'll do is that I will just focus on, since Ram Madhavji has covered about everything, some of the very specific things that have happened in the course of 4 years. The first thing that will strike you, as Ram Madhavji said, was about the cultural dimensions of our policy. And it wasn't an easy shift for the bureaucracy and certainly for the foreign policy establishment to make that big shift. And I remember when he first proposed the idea of International Day of Yoga just before we went to the UNGA in September 2014. And it didn't seem to a lot of people a grand strategy or a grand idea to be put forth before the United Nations in his first speech. But as you're all aware, this was something which was unprecedented. He also situated in the context of global peace, stability, health, and sustainability. So he had a practical manifestation for his call for International Day of Yoga. And it, of course, is now, history knows that it was adopted in a record time of less than 100 days, when it takes nearly a decade for any resolution to get through. And it had 177 co-sponsors, a record for the United Nations General Assembly, and 193 countries. It was unanimously adopted by all 193 countries. And it has since then become a global movement. And at no stage has he said that it is India's heritage. He says it's an inheritance of the entire world. And this is the way he has approached foreign policy. He's not trying simply to claim something as ours, but something which is essentially in the context of global good and humanity. But there are other dimensions of the cultural manifestation, and it's important to note that. One is with respect to climate change. Now, in a country which is, of course, he has deep personal conviction in the challenges of global warming and climate change, and as you know, that when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he had some pioneering initiatives, particularly in the realm of solar. And it was actually as Chief Minister that in 2007, he had proposed the idea of an international solar alliance. And when I was there, he asked me to dig out that letter, which he had written to then Prime Minister. So it wasn't something that he had just thought of when he was Prime Minister. It was there with him for a long time. But in a country where 400 million people are without power, in a country where hundreds of millions still live on the margin of hopes and on the edge of existence, how do you sell the idea of climate change and the need to move to a more sustainable path, even if it entails a certain degree of cost? Now, he situated it in our cultural heritage. Because if you look into the Indian civilization, we've always placed man in the context of nature. And there has not been, as it has been in Western civilization, without any pejorative implications of that, that there was a hierarchy of man and nature. And therefore, exploitation of nature for the prosperity of one species of nature, which is human beings, was something that became acceptable and actually accelerated during the Industrial Revolution over 300 years. And that is something, if you see his speeches in the Climate Change Convention, the COP21 in Paris, this theme comes out repeatedly, that he appealed to the Indians, or the Indian population, on our own heritage of Mother Earth. And it has actually had a tremendous resonance on that. And it is also because of that that he was able to take a more proactive approach, because he was able to switch it and situate it in our own heritage, in our own civilizational development, that he was able to go to Paris with a proactive approach. It wasn't just about a defensive approach to negotiating a climate change deal where we were trying to protect our interests. It was also about offering an alternative solution, which is that one, of course, his argument was clear: the cleanest energy is the energy that is not consumed. So he again went back to this whole holistic lifestyle business and linked it to yoga. The second argument was that it is not going to succeed, our efforts are not going to succeed if we simply talk in terms of imposition of solutions or imposition of arbitrary cut-off benchmarks on countries that may simply rebel against and say, you're closing our options for development. So a better option was to actually support it with affordable, reliable, accessible energy solutions. And that led to the birth of the International Solar Alliance, because the entire approach, Prime Minister's, was that can we make it possible technologically, financially, and through international cooperation for clean energy to be affordable, accessible, and reliable. And that is the approach that has now led, in some sense, in many ways, contributed to bridging that divide between the developed and the developing world in the climate change debate, and creating a sort of consensus around climate change, which led to the adoption of the COP21 declaration and has set the path for climate change in the future. But there is another element which I think needs to be understood, and which is the reclaiming the Buddhist heritage to advance peace and security in Asia. Now, if some of you would recall his speech which he gave at to the Mongolian parliament in May of 2015, he spoke about Buddhism, democracy, and peace in the Asian century. And the idea was there again that this is our, and it goes back to, in some sense, reclaiming your heritage and being able to project it outside, was to go back to the time when messengers of peace went from India and, in a sense, shrunk Central Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia into a common pursuit of, there were conflicts, there were competitions that existed through centuries, but there was also this underlying link that came from India, and which was the link of Buddhism. And after that, there has been an international Buddhist conference being held every year, which is in a sense an Indian initiative, which in a sense are bringing countries together to reflect on what it would take to advance peace and stability in Asia, in now what is roughly called the Indo-Pacific region. And this is an important point, because this was a completely new initiative that came straight from the Prime Minister, that had never been attempted before. And in the same vein, we are now looking at the cultural underpinnings of our relations with ASEAN. It is not, as Ramanuji said, merely a romantic idea or something which is a nostalgia for the past. But it is, in a sense, a return to history. And it's something which I will talk about later because this is the region that for millennia has actually not been Southeast Asia, it's called Indochina, where there have been waves of influence both from China but largely from India. and to understand and to recognize that there is a strong cultural underpinning of this relation which creates an atmosphere of goodwill, which reminds us that India's relations with ASEAN region is at least 2.5 millennia. That's 2,500 years old, forged in peace and friendship, in culture, in commerce, in art, in languages, in religions, and faith. And it creates, therefore, a foundation for both ASEAN and India to work together in a contested region for a cooperative future that respects and embraces the diversities that we have and advances the cause of dialogue. Of course, he has spoken about diaspora, and I think that has been the biggest change in taking foreign policy out of its elite domain into the domain of people. And that's really had a remarkable impact. All of us who serve in the mission have become far more accessible. It takes merely a tweet now for anyone to get help 24/7. So as I say that, this has transformed the relationship between state and citizen, both in India and abroad. When you can use a tweet to get service 24/7, that is a very transformational thing. Social media has been one of the great innovations of our foreign policy, because I think we have been able to reach hundreds of million people, express our point of view real time on social media. And all of us know that in this digital age, it is really the social media which is instantly shaping opinions. And as he said, that has been supplemented by public engagements and public events outside in a major way. That is why sometimes people feel that, is he traveling abroad too much? Because in the course of a single day, if you do 10 events, and it feels like that you have been, but that's so important when you can take it outside the rarefied air of palaces and presidential houses into the streets, into the domain of public, because that is where ultimately democracies make choices at the realm of public, both at home and abroad. And the more we are able to connect the foreign policy to lives of the people and to their well-being, the more we are able to be assured in expressing ourselves. Another aspect which I think needs to be emphasized is the role of Indian states. Now, all of us know that India is a federal structure, and social and economic development is really in the domain constitutionally of the states. And in the course of 4 years, he has emphasized cooperative and competitive federalism at home, but he's also encouraged states to reach out abroad to create partnerships that enable them to advance their own development agenda. And it has become, in a sense, also a competition. Being in Singapore, I can see that, of how, with the encouragement from the Prime Minister, state chief ministers have become more proactive, more dynamic, more engaging in terms of getting partnerships, economic partnerships abroad, whether it is for development of infrastructure or for skills or for smart cities or any of the other flagship initiatives. Maritime security is perhaps the one major contribution that Prime Minister's, and right from the time he came into office, this is one of the first subjects he wanted to be briefed on, the geopolitics and maritime security. And within less than a year, he stood in Port Louis, in the port, against the backdrop of a Barracuda ship that we had given to Mauritius, and against the backdrop of our own destroyer, which was there on a goodwill visit. And he articulated a vision for Indian Ocean region. First time I think it has been done under the emblem of Sagar, security and growth for all in the region. It's a 5-point agenda which speaks of developing our capabilities to defend our interests, but also making it available for all our friends, helping littoral states develop their own capabilities, whether it is in EEZ or whether helping them conduct surveillance. It is about also a cooperative future which he's building through the IONS, but also through the IORA. So security, which we, as he said, Ram Mahadirji, we don't see it exclusively our preserve, but we want to be able to lead the effort in creating a cooperative framework. Fourth is, from security, you jump to a comprehensive cooperation, and finally, not just for countries in Indian Ocean region, but those who have stakes in that region, because it is the transit ocean for the world. And similarly, for the first time, we went out to the Pacific. We landed in the morning in Fiji, early hours in November 2014, had our first meeting with the Pacific Island Forums since independence, and next year we had the Pacific Island Forums, 14 countries in India. And that has been followed by a very nice definition that we prime ministers used, that he didn't call them small island states, but large ocean nations. Because each of them may have a population of 9,000 or 10,000, or may have an area of about a few hundred square kilometers, but the EEZ could be several million square kilometers. So there is a definitional change in the way we link Pacific. And hear his speech in the Fiji Parliament, where he spoke about the confluence of currents of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Another major area of change, and we can answer some questions, is of course in the Gulf region. Now, there are very few countries, from Gulf, we were initially used to look at that region as something where we send our people to work. Then it became a source of energy. Third, it became a market. But now it is all of that, but also a strategic partnership that has a very strong security content to it. So that's been a very big change. And in a region that is where so many fault lines have appeared, it has taken some great ingenuity of foreign policy that we have excellent relations with Gulf Sunni monarchies, with Israel, with the Levant, with Iran, with Turkey, and with Egypt. So it is again based on the premise that our relationships are based not on taking sides, but on their individual merits. And each of those countries realize that our relationship with their adversary is not at the expense of one. And this takes a great deal of confidence to be able to do that. You're all aware of Prime Minister's 5-country visit to Central Asia. 6 countries in 5 days can take a hell of a lot of energy and stamina to do. But it wasn't just those visits. We are following it up with major connectivity initiatives, both through Chabahar into Central Asia and through Bandar Abbas into the International North-South Transit Corridor, which will take us into the Eurasian landmarks. Of course, another important thing is that he has outreach is there to every country, small or large. I don't think that there were countries where no prime minister, no leader had visited for decades, for 20 years, 15 years, 30 years. But I think he's changed that. And remember that when you look at global affairs, each country, irrespective of its size, is a sovereign country that carries a vote in the international organizations. Each of them can make a major contribution to our interests. So this has been a big change over there. Act East, we've already spoken about. But I'll also tell you on the economic side, what has changed really, and as I've seen it over the years, is a direct, not just broad macro strategies of explaining where we are going, but to be able to reach out to specific sectors, to specific investors, to groups of investors, and be rigorous and intense in presenting India's opportunities, India's ease of doing business, the changing environment, and following it up at a micro level. That is what has led to a great deal of confidence in India, not just our growth numbers. Because when people invest, they're investing in for the future. And they look not just to the numbers, they look at the people who make those decisions. Everyone basically evaluates the person, not the numbers, because numbers can be fickle. They can change overnight. So this has been a big change that I used to always remark, having watched this transition, is the absolute corporatized, I think, approach to engaging the global investor community, the global economic community, in making them part of India's transformation and India's growth story. But at the end of it, I think in neighborhood first, if you'll all recall, see, we are living in a neighborhood which is transformed. It is no longer our backyard that it used to be once upon a time. There is a presence of major powers in our neighborhood, at a time when each of these neighbors are going through uncertain internal political transitions, with weak institutions and certainly weak economies. So this plurality of internal politics combined with the presence of a large number of external actors in the region does complicate our regional strategy. And which is why when you evaluate these policies and what we are strategy in the region, look at the complicated environment in which we are operating. And therefore, Prime Minister's objective on neighborhood first is beautifully captured in one line, which he said in Kathmandu. The future I dream for India is the future I wish for my neighbors. Because he said we cannot develop as an oasis, we need to have a secure, stable, and prosperous periphery in which to develop. And also remember that for him, being firm and resolute in protection of India's interests or defending India's borders or India's security is not incongruous with his desire to engage and talk. And that because he comes from the security of being strong and being self-assured. If you are not self-assured, and if you have a sense of hesitation about who you are and what your strengths are and what your direction is, that's when you start sort of becoming ambivalent and being sort of uncertain about what path to take. So it isn't his bold decision to go to Lahore wasn't something which you should look at as a whimsical. That is the kind of willingness to take that challenge and reach out. Of course, it takes two to clap, and therefore we will always wait for an opportune moment. And it's the same with China. 2014, the visit to Ahmedabad by President Shri. 2015, Prime Minister's historic visit to Xi'an, Shanghai, and Beijing. And remember, we started in Xi'an. Because again, it harks back, he wanted to send a message that for 5,000 years we've lived as civilizations together, and that we can live together as Westphalian states as well. And this is where I think he has made that effort in all earnestness. But at the same time, that has never been at the expense of that clarity in that policy, that we are able to defend our interests, as we all saw, and which took the world by surprise, but also earned a great deal of respect around the world. So it is a time when we can simply say Indo-Pacific without thinking about the consequences. We can actually engage people, countries according to our own desire, our own calculus, and our own engagement without worrying about what its impact might be on the other. And which is why we are able to take some decisive and concrete steps forward. And if you see the totality of specific steps, whether it is in our immediate neighborhood, whether it is in our extended neighborhood, whether it's ASEAN, Central Asia, Indian Ocean region, whether you look at Gulf, Mid and West Asia, you look further to Eurasia, to Africa, to especially the eastern seaboard of Africa, which is part of our Indian Ocean strategy. And if you look at the overall maritime security, where the kind of strides we have taken, and I don't think we need to only look at what we have done in terms of our diplomatic engagement, but what we are also doing in terms of strengthening our maritime capabilities. Over the last 4 years, Navy and naval capabilities have received more attention than it ever did. Our assets are going to increase, our capacity to advance our interests and work with the others in the region is certainly going to grow. So maritime domain has received the kind of attention that it hasn't before. So these are the various concrete dimensions of this, of the new foreign policy of New India, as if you might call it that, that has put India, as a lot of people, as everyone in the world unanimously says, as a bright spot, as a global anchor of stability and a global engine of growth.